Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and we're going to continue our lesson today on genetics. Specifically, we're talking about Mendel and his 3 laws. These 3 laws are going to play a great deal of importance as we continue our study in genetics and heredity and how parents pass their genes onto their offspring, okay? These are 3 laws. We really need to wrap our heads around these before we can dive into anything else. So make sure you're following along with me, try your best to pay attention, and without any further ado, we'll go ahead and hop into it and see what we're learning about today. So, Mendel's laws, okay? Let's remember that a scientific law is an evidence-based description of a natural phenomenon under certain specific conditions. And laws have been tested over and over and over again, and every time they're tested, the same results are found. Okay, that's what a scientific law is. Okay, Mendel's 3 laws of heredity describe the pattern of inheritance of inherited traits that he observed. So remember from last unit, he's studying these pea plants and he's looking at these 7 to 9 traits in these different pea plants, and depending on how they're, he's tracking the inheritance of those traits, okay? And he's tracking them, and then he came up with these 3 laws that tries to describe what he found, okay? And we're gonna talk about those 3 laws today. Okay, so these are the 3 laws of heredity that Gregor Mendel came up with. The first one is the law of dominance, okay, and we're going to talk about what these are in a little bit of detail later on. The next law is the law of segregation, and then the last law is the law of independent assortment. Okay, these are going to be really important for today and when we're doing Punnett squares, but they're going to pop up throughout the whole unit. Okay, so these are incredibly important when we're trying to study heredity and how these traits get passed on. Okay, so let's talk about the law of dominance first. Okay, traits are controlled by 2 factors known as dominant and recessive. A dominant trait is one that will be expressed if the offspring inherits at least 1 dominant factor from either parent, while a recessive trait is a trait that is only expressed in the offspring if it inherits 2 recessive factors, 1 from each parent. So a lot of people already, I feel like you might have an idea of what dominant and recessive are. Basically, the dominant alleles are the ones that are, in a certain sense, stronger. So if you have a dominant trait, you're going to show it. A recessive trait is only seen if you have 2 recessive alleles for that trait. And again, these are specifically in something known as Mendelian inheritance. These laws that we're talking about are not always true for different types of inheritance, but for the type of inheritance patterns that Mendel was following, these are correct. So again, dominant versus recessive, if you have a dominant trait, it's going to cover up the recessive trait, and you only show the recessive trait if you have 2 recessive alleles. Okay, so let's kind of walk through some of these pictures and this information talking about these flower colors, okay, and this will kind of give you an idea of what that law of dominance really means. So, the offspring of a red flowered pea plant and a white flowered pea plant all have red flowers. This indicates that the red trait is dominant and it masks the expression of the white trait. So if you kind of look at this picture over here on the left, you'll kind of see what's going on. This individual, this flower, one thing I kind of want to point out, look at this term, P generation. So P generation means parent, and what that means is whenever you're following a trait across generations, the first cross that you do is called the P generation, the parent generation. Okay, everyone after that is referred to as an F generation. So these down here, these are F1, and then if these were to breed, we would have F2, and so these are F2 over here, and that stands for offspring or like a family, basically. Okay, so what's going on here? In the P cross, in the P generation, we have a red flower and we have a white flower, and we're going to cross them together. Okay, when they cross, when they mate, all of their offspring are red. And so that's telling somebody, now that we know that some traits are dominant and some are recessive, well, the red one must be the one that's dominant, right? Because none of these are white. Okay, now Gregor Mendel kind of had an understanding of this, but most of the other scientists at the time wouldn't realize what's going on because this one was red and this one was white. Now look at their genotype down here. Okay, a genotype is like, what are your genes? So up here, this one had 2 reds, this one had 2 whites, but once they breed, remember that you get some of your information from either parent, so from mom and dad. Mom gave each of the offspring a red allele, but the only gene that the dad had to give was the white one. So you can see down here that each of them, we would call these hybrids because they do look red, but they also carry the trait for that white flower, okay? And we'll continue looking at these crosses as we go on here, okay? So now let's go to looking at these in a little bit more detail. When the gametes from homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive parents combine to produce the F1 generation, all offspring are heterozygous. So that's kind of what I was talking about. Both of the parents are homozygous for either the red or the white, but when we mix them together, now everyone in this F1 generation, they're all hybrids, they're all heterozygous. And remember that term hetero and heterozygous means different. And so what it's trying to tell us is that their alleles are different. They got one allele for red and they got one allele for white, and because that red one is dominant, the trait that we see is the red color, okay? So what would happen though, now what we're gonna do, this says red flowers are dominant. And we know that because 1/4 of the offspring have the white flowers, and this means that white is recessive. Okay, we're seeing a 3-to-1 ratio now. So what I wanted to talk about now we took those hybrids, right? This is the F1 generation, okay? This is the F1 generation. These are the hybrids that we made. Well, now we're gonna breed them together. So notice that they are both heterozygous. They've got a red allele and a white allele. The red is dominant, so that's the only color that we're seeing up here. But if we mix two hybrids together, look at the offspring. Now we have 3 that are red and 1 that's white. So what was happening is this white color was like skipping a generation. We wouldn't see it in the first cross, but down here in the F2 generation, now it's popping back up. And so this was like a really big clue to Mendel that we were missing something. Something's here that's being passed on, but we don't see it all the time. But it is popping up in this next generation, okay? And just a reminder here about dominant and recessive, remember that to be dominant is not based on the numbers of individuals with the trait, it's based on the number of copies of the allele that must be inherited to show the trait. So this individual over here, they're showing that recessive trait, that white color, because they got a white allele from each parent. Each parent has a white to give, and if you get both of them, then you show the recessive trait, okay? So what's happening now, so offspring of the F1 generation, the hybrids, can have red flowers if they inherit at least one red factor. They will have white flowers only if they inherit the white factor from both parents. So this is what I was kind of talking about. Over here you can see, okay, so we're starting with that P generation, right? We got a red flower and we got a white flower. They're breeding. When they breed, they have 4 offspring that are all hybrids. These are hybrids, okay? So now we're gonna take 2 of those and cross them together. That's what this is. So we're breeding the F1 generation. When they mix, this is our results. We got 3 reds and a white, okay? So what happened is that white color skipped the generation. It wasn't in the F1, but it did show up in the F2. And this all kind of plays a role of what Gregor Mendel was figuring out with that dominant and recessive. He knew when he saw this happen that that white color must be recessive, and it's getting overpowered, or it's being covered up by that red, that dominant allele, okay? So let's kind of talk about that in a little bit of a different example. We're going to talk about these purple and white flowers here. Okay, so the purple flowered trait is dominant in this example because any individual with at least one copy of the purple allele, which we're using as a capital B, will display the purple genotype. The white flowered trait is recessive because an individual must inherit 2 copies of the white allele to express the white phenotype. So again, if you have one capital letter, you're going to show the dominant trait. Even if you have a capital and a lowercase letter, right? These are both capital, so it's purple. These have one capital letter, one dominant, and one recessive, but you only need one dominant allele to show the trait. So even though we would call these 2 heterozygous because they have a capital letter and a lowercase letter, so these are heterozygous, but even then, it's still showing that purple trait because the purple one here is dominant. You're only going to show the recessive trait if you don't have the dominant allele at all. So this white flowered plant right here, it's got 2 recessive traits, and that's why it's showing up as white. So this is what the law of dominance is showing us, is that usually there's a trait that is more powerful and there's a trait that is weaker, and if you have that dominant trait, you're gonna show it. So this one's purple, these 2 are both purple, and we only see that white when you have 2 recessive traits. So that's kind of what his first law is trying to tell us, is that some traits are dominant and some are recessive. Okay, that moves us into our next law. This is Mendel's second law. It's called the law of segregation. Okay, here's a definition of it that I'll read off real quick. So everyone has a pair of factors controlling each trait, one from each parent. During gamete formation, these factors separate so that only one factor ends up in each sex cell. Okay, so what's going on here is that when we make those gametes, think back to our last unit on meiosis, when we are making these gametes, we're separating these factors, okay? And you only get one from each parent. That's gonna play a really big role when we're looking at pedigrees, okay? So here's like another example of it, okay? In modern terms, homozygous parents in the P generation can only pass one type of allele to their offspring, okay? So for example, when we're looking at this Punnett square here, these are the genotypes of the parent. Up top, we have a homozygous dominant, big B, big B. And on the left over here, this is the other parent, okay? Usually the father is up top and the mother's on the side, but it's not a huge deal. Okay, so over here, the mother is heterozygous. She has a capital B and a lowercase b, and that means she's got a dominant allele and a recessive allele. Okay, but the parent, when we're making these gametes, you only can pass one of them on. Okay, so a mother can't pass on both of her alleles, she can only pass on one of them. And a father can't pass on both of these capital letters, he can only pass on one of them. And so when we're filling out, what's going on here is like these represent the gametes, okay, and then inside of the Punnett square, this is how the gametes come together. So this one up here would be like a zygote, a full individual, and they got a capital B from mom and a capital B from dad. Okay, because what's happening is these alleles are separating from each other. A person can't give both of their traits, they only get one of them. And again, this is leading to, if you have siblings, kind of think about it like this, you and your siblings you have the same parents, right? So you're pulling from the same genetic material, but you and your siblings probably don't look just alike, right? Unless you're identical twins. You probably look a little different from your siblings. And this is because even though you're pulling from the same pool of genetic information, your parents can only give you one trait. So you might be getting different traits from each parent, okay? Great, so let's keep it going. Let's kind of look at it like this, okay? So what's going on here, the heterozygous parent of the F1 generation have 2 different alleles for the gene and can pass on either one, not both, to their offspring. So again, just kind of some vocabulary term to introduce. Over here on the far left, we would call this homozygous, big B, big B. In the middle here, these are heterozygous, okay, because they have one capital letter and one lowercase letter. And then far on the right over here, this is homozygous recessive because they've got 2 little B's. But what's going on is you can only pass on one of these alleles to your offspring, okay? And then we can express, genotypes can be represented with letters, uppercase letters for dominant and lowercase letters for recessive, okay? So depending on, that's why we're using capital and lowercase letters, okay? Capital letters represent the dominant and lowercase letters represent the recessive. Okay, so that takes us to our last law of Gregor Mendel. It's called the law of independent assortment. Okay, what's going on here? When genetic factors segregate into gametes, they do so independently of one another. A dominant allele for one trait does not ensure the inheritance of a dominant allele for a different trait. Okay, another way to say that is all organisms have multiple inheritable traits that are controlled by genes. Each trait is inherited independently of each other. For example, a pea plant might have yellow seeds, which is dominant, and white flowers, which is recessive. Basically what this means is like what the allele that you get for one trait is not going to affect the allele that you get for another trait. So you could have white flowers and have yellow seeds, or you can have white flowers and have green seeds, or you can have purple flowers with the yellow or purple with the green. So that's what we're saying when they sort independently of each other, independent of assortment. One allele doesn't really have any bearing on another allele, and that's only true if the alleles are not on the same trait. So I'll give you an example when these alleles do not separate independently of each other. So I want you to think about someone you know with red hair, okay, someone you know with red hair. That person, if they have red hair, they often also have freckles. And that's because the gene for freckles and the gene for red hair is on the same chromosome. So those are linked, but that's more rare. Most of the time, and these traits that Gregor Mendel were looking at, they are not linked. And so what that means is you can kind of get any combination of these, okay? So here's kind of another way to say that, okay? Traits located on separate chromosomes sort independently of each other during gamete formation. Each gamete receives one chromosome bearing the R gene and one chromosome bearing the Y gene from the original cell. So this bottom bullet point is talking about this picture that we're seeing over here. And I just wanted to show you how they can sort independently of each other. If you look really closely at this Punnett square, this is a really big Punnett square called a dihybrid cross. If you look closely at this Punnett square, you'll see that there is every combination of these two traits, okay? We got in the top left corner, we have a yellow pod that is not wrinkly, okay? But most of the other yellow pods are wrinkly. And then you can have a green pea pod that is wrinkly or smooth. So these are being sorted independently of each other. Just being green does not also determine what the pea pod is going to look like. And being yellow does not determine if it's going to be wrinkly or smooth because they're sorting independently of each other, okay? So I know this stuff can be confusing. Just kind of hang in there. We're going to get some practice as this unit continues. I just wanted to introduce his 3 laws today, okay? So I really appreciate y'all making it to class today. Your teacher has some other work for you to do. Make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.